In the land of Fjorin, winter had long ceased to be a season. It had become eternity. The sun rose like a pale ghost and sank without warmth, leaving behind a sky of endless gray. Mountains of ice guarded the horizon, and the rivers had forgotten how to flow. Villages lay buried under layers of snow so deep that roofs had turned into hills. Yet, amid this silence of frozen breath, life endured. Fires flickered in fur-lined tents, and nomads roamed the plains of ice, guided by stars that barely blinked through the storm. They called themselves the Gjori, keepers of the old songs and wanderers of the frost. One night, during a storm so fierce that even the wolves hid, the Gjori found something impossible. Wrapped in a torn cloth and half buried in snow lay a crying infant. Her tears froze upon her cheeks, but her body was untouched by frost. The snow around her shimmered faintly, like moonlight caught in glass. When the storm ceased without warning, the nomads took it as a sign. The winter spirit had sent them a child, they said, a daughter of the cold. They named her Elara. Elara grew among the Gjori beneath tents of stitched reindeer hide, listening to tales whispered by the wind. She was unlike any other child. While others shivered, she played barefoot in the snow, her laughter echoing across the white plains. When her tiny hands touched ice, it melted into water only to freeze again in delicate patterns of beauty. Frost flowers bloomed on her fingertips, curling and vanishing like dreams. The elders began to murmur prayers when she passed, pressing charms to their hearts, not from fear but reverence. As she grew older, her connection to the cold deepened. When storms raged and tents threatened to tear apart, Elara would walk into the blizzard. The wind would soften around her, swirling like a gentle dance. Her eyes, pale as dawnlight on snow, reflected something beyond human. Even the wolves that prowled the edges of camp bowed their heads in her presence. The Gjori knew then what the elders had whispered for years: she was touched by the winter spirit itself. But with miracles came unease. The more Elara embraced her nature, the less warmth she seemed to carry. Her hands were cool even by the fireside, her breath a mist that shimmered faintly blue. Some among the Gjori began to wonder if she was truly blessed, or if she was the harbinger of the never-ending winter that had cursed their land. They spoke in low voices, saying the snowstorm that birthed her had never truly left. Yet others believed she was their only hope, the child who could speak to the frost and one day awaken the slumbering sun. Elara heard their whispers but said nothing. She felt the pulse of the land beneath her feet, the quiet heartbeat of an ancient spirit buried under centuries of ice. Sometimes, when she was alone on the tundra, she would close her eyes and feel the snowflakes settle on her skin. They spoke to her not in words but in sensations, sharp, soft, eternal. They told her stories of when the world was green, of rivers that sang and skies that burned gold. She longed to see it, not out of rebellion but curiosity. One evening, as the aurora painted ribbons of blue fire across the heavens, Elara stood at the edge of a frozen lake. Her reflection shimmered back at her, half human, half myth. Beneath the ice, she could see movement, faint and slow, as though something ancient stirred beneath. The cold that once comforted her now felt alive, aware. She whispered a prayer, her breath forming a halo in the air. "If I am yours," she said softly, "show me what I am meant to do." The wind stilled. Then a single snowflake landed on her palm, larger than any she had ever seen. It pulsed once like a heartbeat before melting into her skin. A surge of power rippled through her body, not warmth but a deep, thrumming strength. The strength of mountains and glaciers, of patience and silence. Her eyes glowed faintly, and when she exhaled, her breath formed patterns in the air like runes of light. The next morning, when the Gjori awoke, they found a trail of perfect frost leading from their camp toward the horizon. Where Elara walked, the snow was smoother, softer, almost luminous. The elders gathered and bowed their heads, knowing the winter spirit had chosen its vessel. In a world of endless cold, a child once abandoned in the snow had become the living heart of winter, the one destined to decide whether Fjorin would remain frozen forever, or finally awaken to dawn. Years passed, and the little girl the Gjori had rescued from the blizzard grew into a woman whose beauty and presence seemed carved from the very heart of winter. Elara's hair shimmered like spun silver, her skin pale as untouched snow, and her eyes, clear and cold, held the quiet glow of frozen stars. Wherever she walked, frost trailed her steps, not cruelly, but with the serene precision of nature reclaiming its rhythm. The nomads began calling her the Snowborn, a name carried from campfire to campfire, across mountains and valleys, until even the distant villages of Fjorin whispered it with awe and unease. In the capital, King Darrun of Fjorin heard the tales with growing irritation. His kingdom had long suffered from winters that would not end, and now his people murmured that a young woman from the tundra was the chosen of the winter spirit, the same spirit he had spent years trying to appease through sacrifice, prayer, and decree. When yet another frost descended, killing his crops and freezing his rivers solid, his advisors muttered that perhaps it was not the god's anger, but the girl's presence that drew the cold deeper into their land. The king's pride was a fragile flame. He could not bear the thought that a peasant woman, an orphan of the snow, held more power than the throne itself. He ordered his hunters to bring her before him. They found Elara by the edge of the frozen lake where she often wandered, the same place she had once spoken to the wind as a child. She did not run when they approached. The snow around her glowed faintly, reflecting the soft light of the moon. The soldiers hesitated, their breath frosting in the air, unsure whether to kneel or seize her. She looked at them calmly, her voice barely louder than a whisper. "You fear what keeps you alive," she said. "The snow feeds your rivers. The frost guards your seeds. You call it death because you have forgotten its song." Still they took her. Shackles of black iron, enchanted and cold as the void, were bound around her wrists. She was brought to the king's hall, where torches sputtered in her presence, their flames shrinking to weak blue tongues. King Darun sat upon a throne carved of ice and iron, his face red from wine and fury. "So," he said, his voice trembling beneath his own echo, "you are the one who calls herself the child of winter?" "I call myself nothing," Elara replied, her breath forming tiny clouds. "The wind gave me a name, but I belong to no man and no king." Her calmness enraged him more than defiance ever could. He rose, his cloak of fur dragging across the icy floor. "Because of you my fields are barren. Because of you my kingdom starves. If the winter spirit has chosen you, then let the snow claim you once more." Without a trial, he decreed her banishment to the far north, the frozen wasteland where no fire burned and no life survived. The guards obeyed in silence, their eyes lowered, for even they felt shame in carrying out the order. Elara did not resist. As they dragged her through the gates and into the storm, the snow began to fall thicker, heavier, almost protective. The wind howled like a morning song. When the city gates closed behind her, she stood alone in the vast white expanse. Her chains glimmered with frost. The sky above was a dull silver, the sun no more than a faded ghost. For a long time she walked, leaving no footprints behind, only a faint shimmer of ice that refused to vanish. She could feel the land breathing beneath the surface, old and cold, aware of her every step. At dusk, when the wind grew sharp enough to slice through skin, she collapsed to her knees. Her hands sank into the snow. The cold that would kill any mortal simply folded around her like a mother's embrace. "You have returned," whispered a voice in the wind, a voice she remembered from her childhood dreams. "I have," she murmured. "But I don't know why." "Because they still do not understand," the voice replied. "They fear what they cannot control. But power does not belong to thrones, Elara. It belongs to the balance between storm and silence." She closed her eyes and listened. Beneath the surface of the ice, she could hear the heartbeat of the earth, the deep, patient rhythm of time itself. The chains around her wrists began to crack, one link at a time, until they shattered with a soft chime that echoed across the tundra. The snow stirred, circling her gently, and her breath grew bright, glowing faintly in the dim light. The blizzard that had swallowed the horizon suddenly stilled. The air became calm, heavy with something sacred. Around her, the snow lifted, forming a cocoon of swirling light. It did not freeze her, it strengthened her. The same storm meant to bury her alive became her cloak. Each flake that touched her skin melted into energy, each gust of wind whispered her name. She rose slowly, her eyes gleaming with the light of frozen stars. The world around her seemed to bow. The snow that once promised death now pulsed with life, her life. She was no longer just the child who survived the storm. She had become its voice, its guardian, its chosen heart. Far away in the king's palace, frost began to spread across the walls. Flames dimmed and mirrors cracked, showing reflections not of the king, but of a woman standing proud in the snow, wrapped in a radiant white storm. The people who had once whispered in fear now knelt, feeling warmth beneath the cold, a warmth that did not burn but soothed. Elara had been cast out to die, but the snow had claimed her not as a corpse, but as a queen. Elara wandered through the blinding white nothingness until her strength failed her. The wind screamed through the tundra, tearing at her cloak, freezing her tears before they could fall. Each step grew heavier than the last until her knees finally gave way. She fell face first into the snow, her breath shallow, her vision dimming. The cold seeped through her veins, slow and relentless. Her heartbeat slowed, echoing faintly like a drum deep beneath the ice. The snow began to cover her body, a gentle burial offered by the storm itself. The world grew silent, until she heard it. A whisper. Elara. Her name floated through the wind, soft as a sigh, ancient as the first winter. Her eyelids fluttered open, though she could see nothing but endless white. Then came another whisper and another, until the air around her shimmered with unseen voices. They rose and fell like a song sung by the mountains themselves. Elara of frost. Elara of the lost dawn, awaken. A pulse of light rippled through the snow beneath her. The ground trembled, not with fury but with power. The flakes around her stirred as if alive, spinning into spirals that glowed faintly blue. The cold no longer hurt. It wrapped around her like a heartbeat, steady and knowing. Her numb fingers twitched and warmth, strange silver warmth, spread through her chest. When she opened her eyes fully, she was no longer alone. From the mist, shapes emerged, large and graceful, their eyes glowing with pale light. Wolves, carved from frost and moonlight, circled her in silent reverence. Their bodies shimmered with translucent ice, yet their presence was alive, humming with energy. One stepped closer, lowering its head. When its muzzle brushed her hand, she felt memories rush through her, ancient memories not her own. She saw forests covered in eternal snow, kingdoms that once knelt to the winter spirit, skies painted in green auroras. She saw a woman crowned in frost fire, eyes like frozen suns, majestic and fierce. Then she saw betrayal, men with crowns, torches and fear burning in their eyes. The winter spirit's daughter had been struck down, her light sealed within a mortal soul. That soul had waited centuries, for rebirth. The largest of the wolves, their leader, stepped forward. Its voice, when it spoke, was not a sound but a vibration deep in Elara's bones. "Child of the forgotten light," it said. "Do you know who you are?" Elara shook her head weakly, her breath trembling in the air. No one. Just a girl they cast into the snow." The wolf's eyes flared brighter. "You're not no one. You are she who was lost to the mortal world, the daughter of the winter spirit, reborn when the balance faltered. The storm answers to your heartbeat. The cold bows to your will." "I don't understand," she whispered. "If I was meant for power, why did I suffer? Why did they leave me to die?" The circle of wolves closed in, their eyes soft with something that felt almost like sorrow. "Because every storm begins with stillness," the leader said. "Because only through death's breath can you remember life's flame. The winter spirit's essence sleeps until pain awakens it. You were not abandoned, Elara, you were called." The air shimmered. The snow beneath her glowed brighter, and the wolves began to howl, a low haunting sound that shook the mountains. The storm responded like a living creature, its winds swirling upward in spirals of white and silver. Elara's body lifted slightly from the ground, her hair fanning out like threads of moonlight. Her pulse beat faster, merging with the rhythm of the storm. Her eyes turned luminescent, glowing from within. The wolves bowed their heads and the leader spoke again, his voice deep as thunder. "Rise, frostborn one. Rise, daughter of the winter spirit. The world has forgotten balance. You shall remind them." When she stood, the snow that had once sought to bury her began to dance around her feet. Her skin radiated a soft, icy aura that did not burn but froze time itself. She stretched her hand outward, and the blizzard bent to her will. The roaring wind slowed, its violence transforming into harmony. The wolves moved beside her like loyal guardians, their paws leaving trails of shimmering frost. Elara looked up at the swirling sky. "I feel them," she whispered. "Every snowflake, every breath of wind, it knows me." "It remembers you," the wolf replied. "And now so will the world." A tear rolled down her cheek, freezing before it could fall. She took a deep breath of the frigid air and felt it strengthen her instead of weaken her. The cold was no longer her enemy, it was her essence, her truth. Far beyond the tundra, in the heart of Joran's capital, people woke to strange sights. Snowflakes glowing faintly in the air, frost etching symbols of light on windows, and whispers carried on the wind saying one name again and again, Elara. As the wolves vanished into the mist, their voices lingered, "You are the storm reborn. And soon, all will remember the daughter of winter." Elara stood alone in the vast expanse, her eyes burning with silver fire, her breath shimmering like starlight. The snow swirled gently around her, not as her grave but as her crown. "You said." The frost wolves led Elara across the endless tundra, their paws silent over the snow that glowed faintly beneath a moonless sky. The storm had calmed, yet the air still shimmered with power, like the world itself held its breath. Far ahead, through the veil of mist, a faint blue light pulsed beneath the mountain's spine. The wolves halted and bowed their heads. "The temple of your blood," the leader whispered within her mind. "Where your mother's throne still waits." Elara stepped forward alone. Each breath she took crystallized in the air, forming patterns that hung like silver feathers. The glacier loomed before her, vast, ancient, and alive. Carvings of forgotten gods and frozen constellations adorned its face. She pressed her palm to the ice, and at her touch, it began to move. Cracks spiraled outward, glowing like veins of starlight. The glacier groaned, then split open with a deep, echoing sigh. A hidden passage revealed itself, leading downward into shimmering blue darkness. Elara descended, her footsteps leaving no sound. The deeper she went, the warmer it felt, not with heat but with the heartbeat of something timeless. Walls of translucent ice glimmered around her, reflecting her face in countless shifting mirrors. In some reflections she saw herself as she was, a mortal woman with frost-kissed hair. In others she saw a figure of light and snow, crowned and radiant. At last she reached a vast cavern where the air shimmered with pale light. At its center stood a throne carved from living ice, its surface rippling gently as though it breathed. Around it lay frozen runes glowing faintly beneath the frost, and on the ceiling above, the constellations seemed to pulse in rhythm with her own heartbeat. The wolves stopped at the edge of the chamber, lowering their heads. "It has waited since the first dawn you forgot," said the leader. "No one else may touch it." Elara hesitated. "What if I'm not ready?" The wolf's eyes glowed softly. "Winter does not wait for readiness. It simply is." She stepped forward. The air grew still, reverent. Every flake of frost seemed to hang in suspension, watching her. As she approached, the throne's glow intensified, casting her shadow across the frozen floor in long, graceful patterns. When she reached out to touch it, a pulse shot through her hand, cold and electric, yet familiar, like returning home after centuries away. Her fingers brushed the surface, and it melted beneath her touch, reshaping itself as though recognizing its true master. The ice rippled up her arm, encasing her gently, not as a prison but as an embrace. She lowered herself onto the seat, and at once, the chamber came alive. The runes on the floor flared, their light climbing the walls in cascading patterns. The ice hummed with deep, melodic resonance, and Elara's heartbeat matched it perfectly. Her breath formed halos in the air as frost spread across her skin in delicate spirals. Her body began to glow, veins of white light threading beneath her flesh. Then came the crown. From the air itself, snowflakes gathered, tiny, perfect, crystalline. They swirled above her head, spinning faster until they fused into a circlet of living frost, each flake shimmering with its own pulse. When it settled upon her brow, a surge of power coursed through her veins. She gasped, her eyes flaring silver blue. Visions flooded her mind, memories not her own. She saw the first winter queen shaping the seasons, commanding storms and silence alike. She saw her mother's face, gentle yet fierce, whispering, "The cold is not cruelty. It is clarity. Rule with both." Tears of frozen light slid down Elara's cheeks as she whispered, "Mother, I remember." The throne responded, glowing brighter, its edges forming shapes like wings behind her. She could feel the glacier breathing in sync with her heartbeat, every crystal of ice attuned to her presence. She raised her hand, and the frost on the walls followed, curling upward like smoke, forming intricate sigils in the air. Outside, the tundra trembled. Snow began to rise in spirals across the frozen plains. Mountains glowed faintly with inner light. The storm, which had once howled in chaos, now moved in graceful rhythm, answering her unspoken command. Elara stood slowly, her gown transforming into shimmering layers of frost and wind. The wolves knelt before her, their heads bowed in reverence. The leader spoke again, his voice echoing through the chamber. "The winter throne has chosen. The Queen of Frost has returned." Elara lifted her gaze to the ceiling, where the constellations shifted into a crown of stars. For the first time she did not feel cold. The chill was no longer an enemy but an extension of her being, power and peace intertwined. "I am not what they made me," she said softly, her voice carrying like wind through snow. "I am what the world has forgotten." The glacier answered with a resonant hum, and every flake of snow outside began to shimmer in response. Elara stepped forward, the frost beneath her feet blossoming like flowers made of ice. The wolves followed as she ascended from the temple, and when she emerged beneath the night sky, the stars themselves seemed to bow. The people of Fjorin would later say that a pillar of silver light was seen rising from the mountains that night, and that at its heart stood a woman crowned in frost, her eyes burning brighter than any sun. From that moment onward, the winds whispered her new name, the Queen of Winter. Years passed, and the kingdom of Fjorin grew colder than ever before. The sun no longer broke through the endless clouds, and snow fell even in the valleys where spring once lingered. The greedy king who had banished Elara now sat upon a throne of gold that no longer shone, surrounded by walls coated in frost. His fire pits sputtered weakly, unable to fight the creeping cold that clawed at every corner of his palace. The harvests failed, rivers froze, and his people began to whisper that the gods had abandoned them. But the truth was far more haunting. It was not the gods who had turned away. It was the queen he had cast into the snow. The king's counselors spoke in trembling tones about strange lights seen in the northern sky, about wolves made of moonlight prowling through storms, and about a woman whose eyes glowed like twin shards of ice. The king, once defiant, now feared his own reflection, for he saw frost forming in his breath even within his chambers. Desperate, he sent riders into the blizzards to seek her, the snowborn girl, the one he had left for dead. "Find her," he commanded, his voice cracking with age and fear. "Bring her before me so I may beg forgiveness. Tell her the kingdom is hers to heal." But the messengers never returned. Days became weeks, and the blizzards grew thicker, as if the sky itself had turned against him. Then one morning when the palace bells froze mid-ring, a sound unlike any other filled the air, a low melodic hum that echoed from the mountains. The people looked up and saw a white light spreading across the horizon, cutting through the storm clouds like dawn reborn. From that light emerged a figure riding a chariot pulled by 6 immense wolves made of living ice, their fur shimmering like crystal beneath the swirling snow. Elara had returned. Her gown flowed like mist, her crown of snowflakes gleaming brighter than any jewel. Each breath she took sent waves of frost rippling across the ground. Her eyes held no anger, only the still, piercing calm of a storm that knew its own strength. Around her the air itself bowed. The king's soldiers, armored and shivering, gathered upon the frozen plain outside the palace. They watched her approach and felt their courage melt like wax in a flame. When she spoke, her voice was barely more than a whisper, yet it carried through the blizzard like thunder. "Why do you draw swords in a land already defeated by its own heart?" The soldiers lowered their weapons, trembling. The ground beneath them began to shimmer, frost crawling up their boots and legs like vines of silver. Still, Elara's gaze never wavered. The king emerged from his gates, cloaked in furs, his crown crooked, his breath heavy with fear. "Snowborn," he stammered, "forgive me. The famine, the cold, it was never meant for you. I was deceived by fear. Spare your kingdom. Spare your people." Elara stepped closer, her wolves circling the battlefield like silent guardians. "You speak of fear," she said softly, "but fear is not an excuse for cruelty. You cast away a child who could have brought warmth to your land. You traded light for greed, and now you shiver in your own shadow." The king fell to his knees, his hands shaking as frost spread from the earth to his robe. "I will give you the throne," he begged. "Take my crown, take my kingdom, only end this winter." She looked at him for a long moment and then raised her hand. The storm around them went silent. Every snowflake hung frozen in the air. The entire battlefield stood still, soldiers, banners, even the wind itself, as though the world had been turned to glass. Then she whispered one word. "Enough." The frost burst outward in a wave of blinding light. The king's golden armor cracked, his palace walls crystallized into ice, and the battlefield froze solid, a sculpture of men and fear immortalized beneath the snow. Yet not one soul burned, not one scream echoed. It was a silence deeper than death, a silence of peace after centuries of cruelty. When the light dimmed, only Elara stood among the frozen remnants of the old world. Her wolves knelt before her, their eyes glowing faintly, and from the heavens above, a soft snowfall began, not sharp and cold but gentle like a blessing. She raised her face to the sky. "Justice is not vengeance," she whispered, her voice carried by the wind. "It is balance restored." And with that, she turned her chariot toward the north once more. The frozen plain behind her glistened under a sky slowly clearing for the first time in years. The clouds broke apart, revealing faint sunlight spilling across the snow, light that bent lovingly around her figure as she disappeared into the horizon. From that day on, the people no longer feared the snow. They said the storm had found its queen, and through her, the cold had learned compassion. Wherever she rode, the frost shimmered not as a curse, but as a promise that justice, once buried beneath ice, had finally awakened. The frozen throne room was silent except for the faint echo of dripping water, a remnant of melted arrogance. The king sat slumped, wrapped in furs that could no longer keep out the cold, his crown dull and rimed with frost. The once golden banners of Fjorin hung stiff and pale, as though the cold itself had stolen their color. Then the great doors groaned open. A gust of snow swept through, followed by a figure cloaked in shimmering frostlight. Elara stepped forward. The Frost Queen returned to her birthplace, not as the girl left to die, but as the spirit who commanded winter itself. Her hair cascaded like threads of silver, her eyes glowing with the hue of a glacier's heart. Every step she took echoed like the strike of a chisel against stone, reshaping destiny. The king raised his head weakly, his breath a cloud of fear. You should have perished, he rasped. His words trembled in the frigid air. Elara said nothing at first. Her silence was heavier than any storm. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the resonance of howling winds and whispering snow. You left me to the cold, she said. But the cold kept me. It showed me what warmth truly means. Her gaze swept over the chamber, the cracked pillars, the broken statues, the empty thrones where pride once Saturday, and you turned your heart to ice long before winter came. The king tried to rise, his knees trembling beneath the weight of his guilt. I feared you, he confessed. I feared your power, what I did not understand. Elara lifted her hands slightly, and the air shimmered. The walls of ice around them rippled like glass. Within them scenes began to play, visions sculpted in frost and light. The starving faces of the kingdom appeared, children huddled by empty fires, mothers clutching lifeless infants, fields buried under neglect as much as snow. The king stumbled backward as the visions encircled him, his own reflection staring from 1,000 icy mirrors. This, Elara said softly, is the winter you created, not the one I brought. Tears welled in the king's eyes, but even they froze before falling. I see it now, he whispered. The cold was never my enemy. My greed was. Elara stepped closer, her expression unreadable. A single tear escaped her eye, glistening as it fell through the air. Before it could touch the ground, it froze, a perfect crystal suspended in time, then shattered, scattering shards of light that danced through the throne room. Each fragment drifted like a falling snowflake, dissolving into warmth. Where they landed, the frost began to retreat, revealing stone beneath. The king fell to his knees, his crown slipping from his head and rolling across the icy floor with a hollow clang. Do you seek forgiveness? Elara asked, her tone neither cruel nor kind, only vast like the sky above the tundra. Not for myself, the king said trembling, but for the people. They suffer for my sins. Elara studied him, then extended her hand. Her palm glowed softly, like sunlight trapped in crystal. Then let them rise, she said. And learn that winter is not punishment, it is a lesson in endurance, in renewal. The light from her hand spread outward in waves. The frozen pillars melted into streams that flowed toward the doors, racing out into the land beyond. The frost that had chained the kingdom began to dissolve, giving way to glistening water, life returning at last. The soldiers and servants who had gathered outside the hall fell to their knees as warmth touched their skin for the first time in years. The clouds above Fjorin parted, and faint rays of sunlight pierced through, casting golden reflections on the snow. Elara turned her gaze toward the horizon, her expression both sorrowful and serene. I do not return to rule, she said quietly. I return to remind. The king bowed his head until it touched the ground, tears thawing and falling freely now. Then remind us forever, he whispered. Elara looked around the throne room one last time, the place where cruelty had once been crowned and innocence condemned. She lifted her arms and the palace walls transformed into pure ice, glimmering like diamond. With a single breath, she released a whisper into the air, a spell that would never fade. Let no heart here freeze again without cause. As she walked away, her footsteps left trails of crystalline flowers, blooms of frost that sparkled like stars. The people who saw her pass bowed in silence, not out of fear but reverence. They understood now that the snowborn child had not come to destroy, but to heal through the purity of cold. The kingdom of Fjorin, long trapped in endless winter, finally began to thaw, not because the Frost Queen ended the season, but because she taught them to see beauty within it. By nightfall, when Elara vanished into the horizon with her wolves of light, the king stood at his balcony, watching snowflakes drift gently over his reborn land. Each one shimmered faintly, like a memory of forgiveness. And from the mountains beyond, the wind carried her voice, soft and endless, a reminder that mercy, like winter, comes quietly but reshapes everything it touches. The first light of dawn touched the horizon, and the air itself seemed to tremble in awe. Elara stood upon the balcony of the once frozen palace, her cloak rippling in the wind like drifting mist. For the first time in generations, a glow shimmered over the white expanse, not the pale reflection of frost but the living gold of sunlight. She lifted her hand, fingers pale and radiant, and whispered a single word carried by the wind. The world responded. The snow, which had lain heavy for centuries, began to stir. Each flake shimmered and melted into droplets that rolled down the mountainsides, forming rivulets that joined into rushing streams. The great rivers of Fjoran, silent for decades, began to roar with life. The people below gasped as the ice broke apart like shattered glass, revealing the dark, rich earth beneath. Children reached out their hands, laughing through tears as they felt warmth kiss their fingers. The air filled with the sound of water, the scent of soil, and the faint hum of rebirth. Elara watched as color returned to her kingdom. Green crept across the land like a forgotten memory rediscovered. The trees, once bare bones of ice, began to bud with fragile leaves. Flowers pushed through the melting snow, blue, white, and gold, their petals trembling as though unsure if the world was real. The birds returned in flocks, their wings painting the sky with motion. For the first time, laughter echoed through the valleys instead of the wail of the wind. The people of Fjoran gathered beneath the mountain, looking up at their queen. They bowed not in fear but in reverence. To them, she was no longer a spirit of punishment, but a guardian of balance, the one who had turned their eternal winter into the promise of spring. The king, now aged and humbled, walked barefoot upon the thawing earth, tears streaming freely. "She has given us life again," he murmured, his voice breaking. "She has given us mercy." But high above, Elara's glow began to soften. Her reflection flickered in the ice that still clung to the edges of the palace walls. Each ray of sunlight that touched her seemed to draw a piece of her away, turning her less solid, more radiant. The wolves of frost that had followed her howled mournfully as they too began to dissolve into mist and light. Elara looked at her fading hands. They no longer felt the bite of cold, only the warmth she had brought. She smiled, serene and unafraid. Her time among mortals was ending, but her purpose had been fulfilled. She descended from the palace steps slowly, each one leaving a trail of frost flowers that immediately melted into blooming lilies. The people parted before her, heads bowed, tears glistening in the new sunlight. Children reached out to touch her cloak, but their fingers passed through light and mist. "Do not grieve," she said softly, her voice carrying like a melody through the thaw. "Winter was never your curse. It was your teacher." Elara raised her hand once more. The snow around her melted in a spiral, forming pools of clear water that reflected the sky. The rivers carried her reflection away, scattering it across the land. "May your hearts remember the warmth born of cold," she whispered. The words echoed like a prayer, sinking into the soil, the rivers, the roots, and the hearts of all who heard. A soft wind rose, swirling around her in gentle spirals of light and frost. Her hair lifted like strands of silver flame, her eyes glowing with the brilliance of both moon and sun. "For even in the harshest winter," she continued, "kindness is the fire that endures." Her form began to dissolve completely now, transforming into a mist of shimmering snowflakes that scattered across the air, blessing every corner of Fjoran. The people watched as she vanished, not with thunder or storm but in quiet radiance. Wherever her light touched, the ground bloomed. Villages once buried under snow revealed green fields. The rivers sang louder as though carrying her voice through every valley. The clouds parted entirely, revealing a sky so blue that it made the villagers weep. The kingdom of Fjoran, once cursed to endless frost, had been reborn. And though Elara's body was gone, her essence lived on. When the wind passed over the hills, it carried a whisper of her voice. When snow fell, it melted softly on the skin, like a mother's touch. The people called her the Heart of Winter, the one who turned cold into compassion and frost into forgiveness. On the first day of spring each year, the villagers gathered by the rivers she had awakened. They released petals into the water, watching them drift away beneath the sunlight. And every time the snow returned, they did not fear it, for they knew it carried her blessing. Elara's spirit had not left them. She had become one with the land, the air, and the cycle of seasons. Her legacy was not in the melting snow, but in the warmth she had taught their hearts to hold, a warmth that no winter could ever freeze again. Generations passed, and the kingdom of Fjoran became a land of balance, where winter no longer ruled in cruelty but in grace. The people built their homes with wide windows and open courtyards, unafraid of the snow that once meant death. And when the first flakes of the season began to fall each year, they did not tremble. They smiled. For they believed the snow carried whispers, the breath of their guardian, the queen of winter, Elara, the snowborn. In the long halls of their rebuilt villages, storytellers gathered by the fire to tell her legend. They spoke of the girl left to die in the storm, who rose to become the spirit of frost itself. They spoke of her mercy, how she melted the ice not with anger but with love. Children listened wide-eyed, tracing patterns of snowflakes on the ground as their elders said, "When the snow falls softly, she is near. When the wind sings through the trees, she is listening." The people no longer feared the howling storms that swept across their valleys. When the wind rose, mothers would tell their children, "It's only the queen wrapping her blanket around us." Even the fiercest blizzards came to be called Elara's embrace. Travelers caught in them often emerged unharmed, their fires mysteriously burning brighter through the night. Many swore they had seen a pale figure moving through the storm, her eyes gentle as moonlight, her hand guiding them home. As the centuries turned, a new tradition took root. When a child was born during a blizzard, the people called them snowborn. They said such children carried a spark of Elara's blessing, a calm spirit, a heart that stayed kind even in the coldest times. Some of these children grew to become healers who could sense storms before they came. Others could calm wild animals, or walk barefoot through the snow without pain. To be called snowborn was to be seen as touched by the queen's spirit, a reminder that light could live even in the heart of ice. In the temples built in her honor, carved from white stone and crystal, the people lit candles inside bowls of snow. As the flames flickered, they melted patterns in the ice that looked like dancing stars. "She dances," they would say. "Elara dances still." And indeed, in every falling snowflake they saw her grace, the delicate symmetry, the brief beauty before it touched the earth and disappeared. The priests taught that each flake was a piece of her heart, falling to remind the world of balance, that even beauty born of cold must eventually return to the ground and give life anew. The songs of Fjoran changed too. Gone were the hymns of survival and fear, in their place rose melodies of gratitude. Children sang as they built snow shelters, their laughter echoing through the valleys. Farmers prayed not for an end to winter, but for its fair return, knowing that spring followed it faithfully. The balance she had restored became the rhythm of their lives, a promise etched in the sky. Yet the people never forgot the lesson of her final words. In every hardship they remembered, "May your hearts remember the warmth born of cold." When greed threatened peace, when pride chilled compassion, the elders reminded them of the girl who chose mercy over vengeance. And when the snow fell too thick or the winds grew too sharp, they looked out their windows and whispered, "She watches." In time, bards began to travel across neighboring lands, spreading her legend beyond Fjoran's borders. They spoke of the snowborn queen whose tears had turned to stars, whose light had melted an empire's frost. Distant kingdoms sent pilgrims to see the mountains where she once ruled, and some claimed to feel her presence. A shimmer in the air, a sudden warmth on the cheek, a whisper like soft laughter carried by the wind. And so her legend lived on, not in fear, not in power, but in gentleness. The snowborn queen was not remembered for her storms, but for her silence between them, not for her coldness but for the warmth she left behind. Her story became the kingdom's heartbeat, passed from mother to child, from elder to youth, from winter to spring. Even now, when the moon glows over Fjoran's endless snows and the night is still enough to hear your own breath, people claim to see her dance, a figure of light and frost twirling through the flakes, her laughter soft as falling snow. And as each snowflake lands, catching the faint glimmer of starlight, it seems to sparkle with a life of its own, as though the queen herself still breathes through it, eternal and free. They say she was born of frost, but her soul was fire. And in every snowflake that touches the world, her spirit still dances, gentle, eternal, powerful.